Hello. I am Elizabeth Warner. I'm the communications coordinator for the League of Women Voters of Ohio. And we are here today to talk about ads for and against Ohio's Issue 1, the proposed constitutional amendment that would enshrine access to abortion and other reproductive health care. Most of us, I think, are intuitively suspicious of ads. We know that there is likely to be a high degree of manipulation involved because the function of any advertising really is to get us to do something that we might not think of on our own, to get us to buy something that we don't really need or travel somewhere that we'd never been before. And I think that we regard political ads as extra suspect. I think we probably trust a company making cereal more than we trust politicians. But at the same time, political advertising is extremely good at generating strong emotions. All ads are made to make us feel something like pride or hope or desire or shame even. But I think more often fear and anger are the emotions that political ads are hoping to generate in us, because the makers of these ads know that we are less likely to question what they're telling us if we are having a strong emotional reaction. So even when we say that we don't like negative ads or that we don't trust political ads, in general, I think we're pretty vulnerable to accepting what these ads are saying at face value. So we're here today to talk about ads for and against Issue 1. These ads are, we'll get to these ads. I want to introduce our guest for today. Jonathan Entin is the professor of constitutional law, civil rights, and public policy, and the David L. Brennan Professor Emeritus of Law at Case Western University's School of Law in Cleveland. Dr. Maria Gallo is a sexual and reproductive health and epidemiologist, professor of epidemiology, and associate dean of research at the Ohio State University College of Public Health. And Dr. Brianna Mack is the assistant professor of politics and government, teaching media and politics, power and American politics, and voting and elections in the U.S. at the Ohio Wesleyan University. Thank you all for being here today. Jonathan and Dr. Mack are going to help us understand whether political ads in general are telling the truth, and then Dr. Gallo will join us and we'll all watch these 3 ads about Issue 1 and rate them for accuracy. Federal laws govern what advertisers are allowed to say, but only in the realm of commerce. And Dr. Mack, I'm hoping you will tell me where I'm wrong here, if I'm wrong. So the Federal Trade Commission protects consumers of products, but not consumers of political speech. The Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, makes the rules for political advertising, but their authority doesn't extend to the content of the ads. The FCC is more focused on things like fair access to the airwaves and the cost of ads, and disclosing who is responsible for ads. So when we hear messages at the end of a political ad that say, paid for by the committee to do a thing, for example, or I'm Billy Bob and I approve this message, it's the FCC who enforces those laws. But political speech is protected. That's the whole sort of point of the First Amendment, right? The government probably doesn't want to be in a position where they're looked at as censoring public expression of political ideas, and certainly that would make most Americans uncomfortable. So, Dr. Mack, these first few questions are for you. The FCC isn't really looking at ads before they're aired or vetting them for accuracy. Is that right?
So I would argue that they don't have to, right? Mm-hmm. So as you said before, the right to air and making sure that when there are, in particular, campaigns that are looking to air their commercials on whatever broadcast channel or whatever radio station, that they have to make sure that they provide the same opportunity for one camp as for the other camp in terms of actually ensuring that the information that's being aired is accurate. They don't have to do that because we already have libel and slander laws that already exist. And so if any non-factual information is aired, it is on the targeted party to then pursue, justice through those routes.
That's interesting. So are the libel and slander laws, are those specific to a person, or can they be about sort of facts in general?
So it's usually about a person or a group or an entity. But in these cases, I think when you're talking about the information that's being aired about, let's say, a law, for example, or a potential law, then the onus is ultimately on the folks who like made the petition or who are the primaries on that proposed law. If there's anything in there that in particular slanders them or slanders, or what's it called it? Mischaracterizes or misrepresents them and their intent.
So an ad could so in this case, so the folks who put the reproductive rights issue on the ballot, the Ohioans United for Reproductive Rights, they could, if they were named, sue for slander or libel. But the ideas that an opposition ad we're presenting are more fair game. It's not necessarily that the words that they're saying are libel.
Yes.
Okay. So could a local TV station or radio station refuse to air an ad if they find it to be demonstrably untrue, or if they just don't like it, if they are opposed to the messaging, or would that be regarded as censorship?
So yes, it would be counted as censorship. So going back to this whole understanding of, the right to air. And so if a news source or a media source does not want to air one because they disagree with the message, then that means essentially what they're saying is we don't want to air anything, because you can't say no to one and then say yes to the other. It's
So
all
there has to
about
be
equal access. Yeah.
equal access, right? Got it.
So if you don't like the message for one, that means you're choosing not to enter the political game.
Right. Are there things that could be a justification for not airing an ad? So if it's so lies maybe seem to be in that gray area, but if it's violating like an obscenity law or some kind of public safety law, that would give a radio station grounds to say, no, we're not going to air this ad, or is even that sort of questionable?
So like you're asking if the ad is graphic or obscene, and would that be a reason to say no?
Yeah.
I would say in theory, yes, but the reason why I say theoretically is because the producers of said material would never create something that would violate those types of rules and conditions, and thus automatically make it so that their ad could be denied, right?
Yeah.
It costs millions of dollars to make these ads, and so they're not going to waste money creating something that's too dangerous for not safe for TV.
Right. Yeah. So it would be against their best interest, their own interest, to make an ad that would not pass that smell test for the stations. So is it okay then to air a political ad that goes beyond being misleading and that actually has lies? Is that legal?
Dr. Mack is not a legal scholar. And so that's what I tell my students when they ask things like that. I mean, and so you are free to say just about anything and everything that you want to. And that, while we have the freedom to say things, we're not free from consequence. And so that's the way that I phrase it. And so if there are reckless allegations and claims being made, the onus is ultimately upon those who are targeted, as well as those who are consuming this communication, to actually do their due diligence. So I'm glad we're actually doing this webinar, because this is a step towards helping voters do their due diligence.
Right, because we as voters have responsibilities too. We're not just passive sort of, absorbers of all of this. Do you think it's fair to say that voters should not look at a political ad and assume that it had to meet some kind of truthfulness standard to get on the air in the first place?
Absolutely. So everything that we see on TV and on the internet at this point, right, should be taken with a grain of salt. And so because it's relatively easier nowadays to actually place things on the media for us to consume, right? That odds are there may be some type of bias or a framing or a spin on the information that is trying to encourage the viewer to lead to this specified conclusion that the creator is making. And so with that in
And that's
mind,
their job,
yeah,
right? I
it is
mean,
their
their
job.
job is
So
to persuade us, right? So what about ads on social media or other digital platforms that aren't covered by FCC rules? Are they under any legal obligation to fact check or have that same kind of equal access that the TV and radio stations have before they air?
not necessarily so. So I remember Facebook once upon a time actually had like a political ad library, and
Mhm.
you could actually track who bought space, what the ad was, what time A to time B that it aired for their target audiences. And now that library no longer exists. I mean, and the reason for that is because those political ads, regardless, right? They're just buying ad space. So it's no different than seeing like the random pop-up on CNN off to the left or right that's
Right,
talking
right.
about, yeah,
Like banner ads.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so with that in mind, that's why there's been like a lot of discussion about, oh, you're promoting misinformation when social media sites are saying they're just buying ad space.
Well, and so any rules that are happening on a digital platform are decided by the platform owners, or
Yes.
it's kind of the Wild West for them.
Yes.
Okay. Um, Jonathan, I'd like to bring you in here. Can you talk about the legal idea of this, what we were just saying about, is there a legal barrier to airing ads that have actual lies in them?
The short answer is generally not. But let me go back and pick up on a couple of things that have been discussed already.
Mhm.
First of all, I don't think that broadcasters are legally obligated to air political ads. And I think that broadcasters would say that they are free, legally free under the First Amendment to decide that they're not going to accept political ads from one side, because they would say they have a First Amendment right to exercise some degree of editorial judgment. And therefore, if they don't want to run an ad, they don't have to. That I think Dr. Mack is right that looks like it could be a form of censorship, but the First Amendment doesn't apply to private parties. It applies only to the government. So to the extent that we're talking about a private broadcaster, and that's most of them, they don't have a kind of First Amendment obligation to be fair and dispassionate. Now, public broadcasters are a little bit different. They are government, and they may be restricted to some extent in the kinds of viewpoint-based decisions that they make. But that's a detail, right? It is also true that commercial broadcasters, although they may not have an obligation to run any political ads, they are legally obligated to give political advertisers their most favorable ad rates if they're going to run them at all. That was something that Congress did because a lot of broadcasters decided that they were going to jack up the rates for political ads because they thought that the political campaigns would be willing to pay for them. But Congress made the judgment that political ads, even though we might be skeptical about some of the specific statements, political ads are an important part of self-government, and it's important to make it easier for people to get information about political candidates, for example, than consumer goods. But the general First Amendment rule is that the government doesn't pre-approve or pre-screen what people want to say in the political arena. And maybe the best way to describe this is something that Justice Brandeis wrote about 100 years ago. The remedy for bad speech is more speech, not enforced silence. So if you get a political ad that is false or misleading, as Dr. Mack says, it's going to be pretty hard for people to sue for defamation. I mean, there may be something defamatory there, but that's typically not the kind of controversy you have about political ads. So the idea is that if one side says something that's false or misleading, that the other side will come back and point out that's false and misleading. And if the false or misleading statement is really bad enough, the rebuttal might be really effective and undercut the arguments that the original false or misleading speaker has made. But that means that you have a whole lot of latitude to say things, right? The First Amendment is pretty protective of political speech. Political speech is the heart of the First Amendment. And so courts are generally reluctant to allow the government to come in and choose sides and say, this is a false statement, that's a true statement. The government might have a point of view, but in the middle of a political campaign, the government isn't supposed to be the referee when it's also a participant.
Yeah, acting as the arbiter when, sure, yeah. So from a constitutional perspective, then, does free speech kind of trump everything else here? And I know that this is a kind of constant tension in all government regulation, that, you know, we're trying to balance the needs of a population with the foundation of our Constitution. But standards for accuracy or honesty in political ads, what is the sort of guideline that is used from a legal perspective?
As I said, generally the legal response is, if there's a question of truth, the government doesn't decide. You leave that. Truth is going to be discovered in the clash of ideas. We have Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes talked about the marketplace of ideas, and the test of an idea is its ability to carry the day in and persuade people that it is in fact true. Now, in the short term, that doesn't always happen, but our free speech law has developed with a strong bias against having the government put a thumb on the scale and say, this is a true statement, that's a false statement. You and I and people who are engaged in politics and the process of self-government have the right and the opportunity to get into the arena, and we can say something is true or false, but generally the government does not get to say that.
Are there any other constitutional arguments that go outside of the First Amendment that could challenge this? So, I'm thinking equal protection, 14th Amendment kind of arguments. Is there anything there, or is that something that is so sort of out there that it's not relevant in this moment?
Well, I think we could say, I think it would be hard to make an equal protection argument as a basis for having the government step in and say this statement is true or false or deceptive. I mean, we're not talking about a consumer product here, right? We're talking about
and that's the big difference
speech,
between
right. And okay, now there are other views of the First Amendment that work from the premise that the marketplace of ideas doesn't really work, that some people have greater resources or greater access, right? And so some of our campaign finance rules, for example, were proposed out of a sense that we don't have a completely level playing field. But the Supreme Court has been more or less skeptical of that sort of argument for a long time, although there are some sorts of campaign rules that have survived. So, for example, requirements that the source of that a candidate actually take responsibility for ads on the candidate's behalf. Rules that say that if you're going to give money to a political campaign, you need to disclose. Now, those rules don't apply to so-called independent groups, and that's a real issue.
Dark money,
right, and but at this point, and I think that there is a respectable argument to be made, even under the First Amendment, that the rules governing so-called independent expenditures are too permissive. But if you think about, say, Citizens United, which the Supreme Court decided in 2010, and that's basically opened the door to massive amounts of so-called independent expenditures that are, at least in theory, separate from a political campaign. Right?
So the ads that we're seeing, come from, as you're saying, everywhere. They could be, these kind of dark money funded things. They could be from candidates. They could be from the organization, the campaign that is right. Directing an issue, like in the case of the Ohio issue 1. Is it too simplistic to say then that ads can say anything, that there really aren't barriers? So I'm thinking practically speaking. So, I think I'm hearing that the arguments to having it just be a free for all are there, but in reality, and Dr. Mack, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. What we're seeing in the ads today, there's no obligation to truth here. Is that fair to say?
It feels so icky to acknowledge that.
It really does. But are we acknowledging that?
Well, I think that in a way we are, and part of this comes out of a classic, or it might be traced back to what I think is probably the greatest of all First Amendment cases, New York Times Company against Sullivan, which says that government officials have to put up with sometimes false statements. The Supreme Court said in that case, this, by the way, was a lawsuit filed by the police commissioner in Montgomery, Alabama, and the ultimate goal was to keep the national press from covering the civil rights movement in the South by making it too expensive for the press because they'd have to pay these enormous libel judgments, right? Mm-hmm. But the Supreme Court said in New York Times against Sullivan that we have a profound national commitment that debate on public issues will be uninhibited, robust, and wide open, that false statements are inevitable in passionate debate, and it should be really hard to hold people legally and financially responsible for their false statements unless, and this is in the defamation context, so it doesn't necessarily apply to these ads, unless we are talking about statements that the speaker knows are false or has shown reckless disregard for the truth. And so in the context of a political campaign, particularly like like a referendum, such as issue 1, the idea is that we expect a passionate debate, we expect inaccurate statements, and therefore the remedy is for the opposition to, or the other side, to point out, hey, these folks have been making these really off the wall arguments, and you should recognize here's why they're off the wall, and you should not take these people seriously, and you should vote in effect to punish the people who are making these wildly off the wall statements. Right now,
Well,
people will have different views about which ads or which statements are off the wall, but that's the standard First Amendment response, is that we each make up our own mind about who's telling the truth or who's closer to the truth, and vote accordingly.
so it's up to voters, really,
Yeah.
in the end. And voters should know that what they are consuming in these ads are there's not necessarily an obligation to truth in these ads, and that we as voters and voter advocates need to be able to look at them critically and really analyze where they're coming from and what their potential agendas and potential truths might be. So with that in mind, here's what we're going to do. We've chosen 3 ads that are currently being aired about Ohio's issue 1. 2 are from the no side and 1 is from the yes side. So we're going to watch them one at a time and then rate them for accuracy using a 5-point scale. Here's our scale. 1 is fact-free, 2 is mostly false, 3 is truthy, 4 is mostly true, and 5 is all facts. Once we've seen the ad, we will each rate it, and then we'll explain our rating. So here's where my skills as the moderator are about to be tested. I'm gonna share my screen. We're gonna watch the first ad, and we will take our notes, and we will hold up our answers in just a second. So let me get us in here. The first ad that we're going to see, can you guys see my screen here?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So this first ad is with Governor Mike DeWine and First Lady Fran DeWine. So here we go.
Everywhere we go, voters tell us they're confused about issue 1. So Fran and I have carefully studied.
Issue 1 would allow an abortion at any time during a pregnancy, and it would deny parents the right to be involved in their daughters making the most important decision of her life.
I know Ohioans are divided on the issue of abortion, but whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, issue 1 is just not right for Ohio.
Issue 1 just goes too far.
Everywhere we go, voters.
Okay, they heard it once. Thank you, Governor. Okay, so we've seen this first one. Maria, can you go first since this is our first hearing from you?
Sure.
So 2. Okay.
I scaled this as mostly false.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about why?
Sure. So this ad makes, in my mind, 3 claims. The first is that issue 1 would allow an abortion at any time during pregnancy, and that just isn't true. The law allows for an abortion before the time of viability, which is about 22 to 24 weeks. After that point, abortion can be restricted, but it has to be allowed to, in the case of helping save the life or health of the pregnant person. That does not, there's just not a world in which that means that somebody can get an abortion at any point in time. Besides the law, doctors also have a professional obligation to uphold medical ethics. And so it's just not the case that someone could be 9 months pregnant, decide they don't want to be pregnant anymore, go in and say, I want to have an abortion. It's just not going to happen. So the first claim to me is fact-free. It's just not true. There's a second claim that it would deny the parents the right to make decisions. And this is something that we've heard over and again, I think, in this lead up to this vote, that this amendment would stop parents from having the ability to consent to medical care. It would supersede or take away the parents' right to decide whether their children can get an elective medical procedure, and that's just not the case. And in fact, the Attorney General Yost came out and wrote a interpretation of the issue and posted it. You can look on it online. And he says in that interpretation that he specifically says the amendment does not specifically address parental consent. So parental consent is not part of this amendment. Currently, children cannot get an elective medical procedure without their parents' consent, and this amendment would not change that at all. The third thing that the ad stated was that issue 1 just goes too far. And that's an opinion. So I said mostly false because I believe that they think that it goes too far. And so that's something that you might think is true, you might think is false. I think it really hinges on whether you think that the state should be deciding, should have a role in deciding about your healthcare, or whether you think that this is something that should be decided between a person and their doctor. And that's an opinion.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Mack, what did you think?
Let's see. So I also, wrote it backwards. I also wrote a 2, however. So I agree with Dr. Gallo. My thought processes are a little bit different. I was looking more so at direct content as well as the title. So I imagine if a person sees this ad, or especially on YouTube, and sees studied the DeWines, they're going in thinking about, oh, well, this is the governor and first lady, right? And that they're going to tell us information about issue 1. They're going to clarify things. However, they do not clarify. They just acknowledge that, yes, all of the rhetoric and discourse about issue 1 is confusing. And it is confusing. And that's it. And so everything else they say in the video are basically false facts, right? And then at the end, it ends with, whether you are pro-life or pro-choice, you should still say no, which is implicitly saying you should be pro-life. And so that's why I said it was mostly false.
We got it. Okay, so 2 and a 2. Jonathan, what did you have?
Okay, well, we all agree that it's a 2. And I don't have a lot to add here. I guess I would say that the statement that issue 1 would allow abortion at any point in pregnancy as a legal matter, I think is not that's not false, but it is misleading, because issue 1 says that the state can limit post-viability abortions, but there has to be a good health-based reason for doing so. I'm happy to defer to Dr. Gallo, who this is her field, right? But I mean, I think if you parse the language, it is conceivable that there could be a really late term abortion. But I'm as I said, I'm happy to defer to Dr. Gallo, saying that this is highly unlikely and maybe is not going to happen at all, right? So I wouldn't count that statement as flat out false. I would say it's really deceptive. The statement about parental consent seems to me to be not accurate. We will probably have a chance to talk more about that with some of the other ads. But Dr. Gallo is right. The Attorney General has pointed out that issue 1 does not specifically address parental consent, but it is possible that if issue 1 passes, someone will challenge the parental consent law. And it is possible, although I think unlikely, that a court would say that the parental consent law is inconsistent with issue 1 but I know we're going to talk more about that later on, and I can explain why I think that's not a very likely outcome. The last statement strikes me as an opinion, and I don't know that opinions aren't true or false. They are opinions, and we're all free to agree or disagree. I think that statement is the one piece of the ad that strikes me as maybe contributing something to the overall discussion, because basically the question that issue 1 is asking the voters to decide is, how accessible should abortion be? Some people think that abortion should be rarely, if ever, allowed, maybe only in exceptional circumstances. And for those folks, issue 1 does maybe go too far, because it makes abortion more readily available than some people might be comfortable with. On the other hand, other folks think that abortion should be relatively easily obtained, and issue 1 provides for a robust abortion right. But as I said, those are opinions. I don't feel comfortable evaluating an opinion on a true false scale, because I just don't think that it fits.
Fair. Okay. So all 3 of you are 2. I also am a 2. I was on the fence actually between a 1, a fully false, fully fact-free, and 2 for being mostly false, because again, substantively, everything in this ad is false or at minimum misleading. But technically they are, in fact, Mike and Fran DeWine, so that is not a lie. Ohioans certainly are divided on the issue of abortion. And this is a confusing thing for Ohio voters. So when Governor DeWine says, everywhere we go, voters tell us that they're confused about issue 1, I can certainly validate that. I have many questions every day from voters who are very confused. And it is no wonder, because the disinformation being thrown at voters is meant to confuse us. And ads like this only add to that confusion. But voters are also confused because we just had an election in August for another issue 1, which was, about the processes for constitutional amendments and not about abortion. But we saw a ton of disinformation about abortion in relation to that special election too. And voters are also confused because of the ballot language. What voters see when they are going into the voting booth, what they see when they're looking at their ballot, was written by politicians to ostensibly to simplify amendment language, which is the function of the ballot board, the folks who rewrote issue 1 for voters. But in practice, it has distorted the meaning of the language of the actual amendment and the language that was actually approved by the Attorney General and that would go into the Ohio Constitution if voters pass issue 1. So yes, Governor DeWine, the voters are confused. So yeah, I give it a 2 there.
Could I just say, excuse me,
Yeah.
just make one point. If you're going to the polls, the full text of the proposed constitutional amendment will be posted at your polling place.
Yes.
So if you're not sure what it says, go read the language, the actual language that's posted at your polling place.
That's right. Yeah. And to Jonathan's point, every polling station, and that includes early vote centers for folks who are voting this weekend, is legally obligated to have a copy of the proposed language at the location. But that is something that voters need to know to ask for. We will put the language for both the ballot language and the amendment language in the chat of the YouTube recording when we are finished today, so voters can have a chance to look at it, and you can find that on our website as well. Okay, our second ad is also an ad that is opposing issue 2. It's called Closed Door, and once again, test my abilities here. We're going to look at this ad from, can you guys see my screen here?
Yes.
Yep.
Great, wonderful.
A closed door. On the other side, your daughter making the biggest decision in her life to get an abortion or not. Today, you have a right to go through that door, to be there for her, to help. If issue 1 becomes law, that door locks forever. Your rights as a parent, gone. To keep the door open, to be there for her. Vote no on issue 1. A closed door.
Okay. See, that's where my skills are challenged. Okay, so for the second ad here, Dr. Mack, can we start with you again?
So, okay, I gave it a 1.
Mhm.
And the reason why I gave it a 1 is because the citations or the sources that are mentioned in this article, first one being the Ohio section 2919.121, the revised
Mhm.
code.
Mhm.
If you look it up, it explains exactly what are the circumstances in which a pregnant minor could or could not. And in all of those situations, right, it's when the minor leaves. And so it is false in the fact that the parent, even if issue 1 would pass, that parent would lose those rights, because it doesn't go down, it goes through family law first, essentially. Secondly, the second source that is cited, the National Review, took some time actually try to find the article in question that it was making a reference to, and that is an op-ed. And so if viewers don't know exactly what the National Review is, it is a conservative publication that publishes a lot of commentary, and the article in question is an op-ed from the president and vice president of the Judicial Crisis Network. And that is an organization that, promotes the placement of a lot of conservative leaning justices at the federal court level. And so citing a op-ed from a commentary publication inside of this commercial and touting it as, actual research or, something from a journalist doing research, things of that sort, is problematic. And so that's why I argued it was 1.
So 1 from Dr. Mack. Jonathan, how about you?
I gave it a 1.5. And here's why. I agree with what Dr. Mack has said here, but let's be clear. The current Ohio, that statute that is referred to, that statute says that a pregnant minor can get an abortion with the consent of one parent, or if she can't get parental consent, she can go to court and obtain a ruling from a judge that an abortion is in her best interest in her circumstances. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld that very law in a 1990 case. And that's, back years before Dobbs, back when the Supreme Court had recognized a strong federal constitutional right to abortion. The Supreme Court has upheld at least one other essentially identical parental consent law from another state. So we have, as Dr. Gallo pointed out with regard to the previous ad, we have a statement from Attorney General Yost, who, by the way, is against issue 1 for other reasons, saying that issue 1 doesn't speak to parental consent. So if issue 1 passed, nothing would change. The only way we would have a change would be if, after issue 1 became effective, somebody challenged the parental consent law in a lawsuit. And I think it is unlikely that that lawsuit would succeed, precisely because the U.S. Supreme Court, whose rulings are not binding on the meaning of issue 1, but think since we're talking about a robust abortion right, if the idea is that this parental consent law was constitutional when we had a strong federal right to abortion, I think it is very likely that the same parental consent law would be consistent with issue 1 when we have a strong state parental consent law. One other point to pick up on something that Dr. Mack said, that opinion piece in the National Review that is cited in this ad makes some other really wildly implausible claims about the meaning of issue 1 as well. And so to me, relying on that opinion piece undercuts the credibility of the argument that issue 1 would by its own force eliminate the parental consent law. Just not right. But as I said, I gave it a 1.5 rather than a 1 because I think that it is, there is a possibility, however remote, that the Ohio Supreme Court might at some point say that maybe the parental consent law is inconsistent with issue 1, although I'd be really surprised if it said that.
Okay, so 1.5 from Jonathan. Dr. Gallo, what do you think?
I gave it a 1. I think this ad is fact-free for the points that have been raised. I don't think that, I think it's clear that this amendment would not change the parental consent law. I also would add that, if you look at the ad, what it said was, your rights as a parent are gone, right? That's scary language. Parents don't want to lose their rights. Who wants to lose their rights? The ad says your rights as a parent your rights as a parent are gone. Ironically, though, if issue 1 didn't pass and we went back to a restrictive environment, such as where we were with a 6-week ban, parents in that situation would lose rights, right? So they would lose the right to, if they wanted their child to get an abortion, they would lose the right to get that in Ohio. And we saw that in the case where that mother had to bring her child, who was raped at age 9, was 10 at the time of the abortion. She had to bring her out of state and go elsewhere to seek it because she lost the right to seek medical care for her child. So it's a little bit, for mine, I'm definitely a 1 on this because I think it's completely fact-free. And it really is holding up parents' rights, but not showing the whole picture that actually, if we didn't have issue 1, parents might lose rights. They might lose the right to seek health care for their child.
Yeah. Okay. I gave it a 1.5. The statute that they referenced is a real statute, and so I gave them credit for that. I thought this one was psychologically interesting. They, coming just kind of from a political communication perspective, they kind of start with the darkness and the separation of the parent and the child, and then they bring the mother and child together, and it's kind of the golden hour. And as a as a mama, I certainly appreciate the idea that when mothers and daughters are brought together, everything is made better. Though I'm not sure my daughter would always agree with that one, but that's not the reality for many people, and it's also just not relevant in this case. So again, I gave it a 1.5 as well, because substantively on the facts, I agree with what you all have to say. Our last ad is from the yes side, and let me get back over here. So we are, let's see, this ad, I'll see this one.
What could happen in Ohio if issue 1 doesn't pass? Abortion banned with no exceptions for rape or incest. And women who miscarry could be denied emergency care. So vote yes on 1 to stop Ohio's extreme abortion ban. What could happen in Ohio if...
Well, I've done that all 3 times now, so I'll know not to do it for the next one, right? Okay, Dr. Gallo, can we start with you again on this one? How did you rate this?
Sure, I gave it a 4.5. I don't know if you can see that, because it's mostly true. I mean, if you start off with an ad, what could happen in Ohio, you really can say anything after that, right? So technically, I would say technically it's true, completely true. But it suggests that if issue 1 weren't to pass, that we would go back under the 6-week ban. That's what it's suggesting. And I think that seems very likely that that's what would happen. So I think I think the word could is doing a little bit of work here, right? What could happen? But I think what it's showing is what we could expect would happen. Best predictor of future is to look at the past, what happened. And so a Republican controlled government is going to, it seems likely that they would reinstate that 6-week ban. That ban that currently is on pause, it's likely that it would come back into play.
Dr. Mack, what did you think?
Let's see. It shows, yay. I gave it a 4. The reason why I gave it a 4 is because, yes, it is mostly true. And I was thinking about what I heard versus what I saw. And so while we heard what could happen, we saw abortion banned across the screen. And so if you're an uninformed voter, you might think, oh, well, if I don't vote yes, that means currently abortions aren't allowed in Ohio, which is a little bit different, right? So we know that the 6-week ban is on pause. So that means we're back to our original stance of it being somewhere in the 20-ish weeks threshold for being allowed to have an abortion at the latest, right? And so if you're not aware of that and all you can think about is what you saw on the screen is that if I don't vote yes, then no more abortions, then that is a bit misleading. But outside of that one thing that I have an issue with, everything else said was factual. And so I agree with Dr. Gallo that the could allows for a lot of wiggle room.
Right. Jonathan, what about you?
I gave it a 4 also. I think if issue 1 fails, at this point, as Dr. Gallo says, the 6-week, the so-called heartbeat law is on hold. But whatever happens in the Ohio Supreme Court in that case, if the legislature would reenact that or something else, but we're talking about what might happen, not necessarily what will happen. Now, there was a second statement in this ad, and I will defer to Dr. Gallo because she's the medical person here. But the claim was that people would not be able or would be denied miscarriage care. Now, we know that there have been some well-publicized incidents to that effect, indeed, including some in Ohio. But I'm not sure that the denial of miscarriage care is a necessary consequence of the failure of issue 1. I think the question would be, what do the abortion regulations or the abortion restrictions that are on the books or that would be on the books, what would they say? And part of the reason that people are getting denied miscarriage care is a concern that the existing regulations are sufficiently unclear that some health providers have been unwilling to risk the draconian legal sanctions that might follow if they are found to have violated those restrictions in the course of treating a patient. So that's a little bit ambiguous, although I think the point is, it's a legitimate point. Whether in a 15-second ad or a 5-second piece of a 15-second ad, you could get those sorts of nuances. That seems like a bit unrealistic. But I think that there is more truth in this ad than we saw in either of the others, even though there are some fuzzy areas in this ad.
Dr. Gallo, did you want to say a little bit more about the potential for people who are miscarrying to be denied emergency care should issue 1 not pass?
Yes. So, that line between what is sure, true. It's true that if somebody came in, maybe the law would be written in such a way that they could be provided care for a miscarriage, but it's really hard to think in practice how that would work. People's medical situations are complex. If you're coming in and you have a patient who maybe has started a miscarriage and needs help in finishing it, it's an incomplete spontaneous abortion, and they need help in treating it, that clinician might be concerned if they're facing the threat of incarceration. If they perform an abortion, they might decide not to do it. So it's really hard to say that we're going to come up with every medical circumstance. We're going to write this into law and tell providers how to behave. We just can't do it. And so what will happen, it will turn out that providers will be conservative in their interpretation because they don't want to run afoul of the law. They don't want to risk losing their medical license, something they've worked all their life for. And so we know this. We can see this in other settings, both in the United States and in other countries. What happens when you try to legislate medical care? Doesn't work. There's a reason that the professional associations are in favor of issue 1 and other laws like this, because it doesn't work in practice to try to legislate medical care. You're going to end up with tragic circumstances. And we've seen this already during the short period where the 6-week ban was in effect. We saw tragic examples because we can predict that this will happen.
Okay, thanks for giving a little background for that. Okay, so kind of as a final wrap up, what stands out to all of you about these ads? Was there a winner? And I say winner because political ads, nobody's really winning here. But was there one that felt especially outrageous or especially maybe ideal to you? Dr. Gallo, what do you think?
I think the one with the closed door seemed the most biased to me, and my scores reflected that, right? It was designed to make it scary as a parent. As a parent, I'm a parent of 3 children, and I want to be involved in their healthcare. I don't like the idea of losing rights as a parent, and so I think it was designed to invoke the most sort of visceral reaction in someone watching it, while at the same time not presenting anything that was true.
Okay, Jonathan, what about you?
I think let's put aside the accuracy of the statements. I think all of these ads were well designed for the points that the proponents wanted to make. And so just as a piece of craftsmanship, I think that, they're pretty well done, they're pretty well produced. But I agree with Dr. Gallo that that closed door ad, as my score indicated, was the most problematic. And I think that the what could happen ad has a lot more substance to it. But none of these ads would be the sort of or has as much substantive weight as you might want to have, because look, they're 15 or 30 seconds. They don't have the time to develop a detailed or sophisticated argument, right? They're designed to grab our attention and to motivate us to go in one direction or the other. That's what ads are for. And I think it is unfortunate that so much of our political discourse has been reduced to 15 and 30-second spots, because that doesn't encourage the kind of thoughtful consideration that really hard issues like this deserve.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. Dr. Mack, what did you think?
So, as the media scholar, I enjoyed all of these ads. I always love general election season because you get to see the best of the worst. And with that in mind, I'm actually tied between both the DeWine ad as well as the closed door ad, just because both are similar in promoting this anti-issue one stance, but uses emotion and emotion to encourage people to say no. You harp on your worst fears, to take away your parental rights, right? To take away your ability to make choices if you can, right? And so hooray for fear mongering, as well as hooray for conditional language. And so conditional language and emotions for the win. I think that's the true winner here.
Okay. Yeah, I would agree with that. You both, that these ads are very well done. I think they're very effective. They're well produced. I think if there's a winner, again, winner for me, it is the DeWine ad. I guess coming from a voting advocate perspective, I think we're all a little cynical about political ads generally, right? And I think we might even expect political ads to be misleading, and I think we're kind of viewing them through a lens of sure, these ads are meant to persuade me to be in agreement with them, so big heaping grain of salt. But for an elected leader to promote disinformation is frankly just disappointing to me, particularly coming from Governor DeWine. And I feel like at a time when American trust in our institutions is really at an all-time low, I think that there is an added obligation for people who are elected by the citizens to more accurately represent points of view. And I think it's honestly dangerous for an elected official, particularly one at the leader of a state, to be so dishonest. I wish I had a softer word for that, but it's really it's disturbing, and I think it undermines Ohioans' faith in government, which ultimately is a threat to democracy. So that, I think, was my winner for today. Before we go, is there one thing that you think voters should know about these ads, or about political ads in particular? I know we all are saying that it is on us as voters to be responsible for the content that we're consuming and how we receive it. But what would you say beyond that, Dr. Mack?
If you are watching live TV and you don't have the ability to pause TV to actually see what's going on, try to remember as much as you can about the ad and Google it. Google is your best friend, but also can be your worst enemy. So even when you're trying to do research for issue one, at least on my end, the top result that shows is actually a third-party explanation of issue one that's false. And so if you're going to spend, and I tell my students, you spend about 5 minutes researching something so you can at least get to the quickest decision, spend 6 minutes, click on a couple more results. If you're going to watch videos, click on a couple more videos. And when you see like the citations for whatever they're referring to, try to look those up. Because just like some student research papers, they could just be copying and pasting any type of citation. And then if you look at the citation, you realize it's not true. So due diligence, just don't rely on what we see on the ad. Do some more research, because there is a lot of discourse and a lot of it is very confusing, and a decent amount of it is actually false.
That's great advice. Thank you. Dr. Gallo, what would you want voters to walk away with when thinking about ads?
Yeah, maybe I'll just elevate two things that others have said on this panel. Dr. Entin already said, look, these are 15-second ads. Maybe I will go even farther and just say, like, don't rely on ads, right? If you're trying to learn about the issue, you're probably not going to get it from a 15-second ad. And so to reinforce what Dr. Mack said, yes, you probably want to look at other sources, read a little bit deeper, talk to your neighbors. This idea that we would talk to others and have a conversation about this, I think about this or any other issues that we're thinking about, is an important part of democracy.
Sure, for sure. Thank you. Jonathan, what do you think?
I think it's really unfortunate that this whole discussion has devolved on focusing on ads, particularly when some of the ads are really peripheral to what's going on. I mean, this is a hard question because abortion and reproductive rights are hard issues for a lot of people. When you are deciding what to do, it's probably enough for you to understand that issue one will provide a pretty robust protection for reproductive rights. Ask yourself, what do you think about that? Don't get so down in the weeds about parental rights or late-term abortion, or some of the other kinds of more out there claims that have been made in other ads that we haven't screened today. This is basically yes or no. Do you support a robust kind of reproductive autonomy, or do you not? That's what issue one is ultimately about. And it's about not just abortion, it's about a whole raft of other things that we haven't talked about, like access to contraception. We briefly touched on miscarriage care, the right to carry a pregnancy to term, lots of issues like that. The ads basically have not focused on the big picture. They focused on the minutiae, and the proponents of the ads may have their reasons for that, but the voters ought to keep their eye on the big picture.
Yeah, for sure. And I would just add an echo, really, ask questions and ask questions of experts like the three of you. So thank you all for being here today. Just want to wrap up with a reminder that Election Day is Tuesday, November 7th. Early voting is happening through the weekend. Saturday, it's 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Sunday, it's 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. Make sure if you're voting in person that you are bringing your unexpired photo ID. If you're voting by mail and if you have not yet returned your ballot, know that it must be postmarked by Monday or hand-delivered to your Board of Elections by Tuesday, no later than polls closing at 7:30. For voting questions, please go to the Ohio Secretary of State's website at voteohio.gov or our own site, League of Women Voters Ohio, LWV Ohio, where we also have FAQs about issue one and some other resources as well. So happy voting to everyone, and thank you.